I think some of you came here for coffee. And some to walk the dog. And some of you came to have a little political conversation. And I decided to try this as a format, and I chose West Seattle as my first try because I knew that this coffee house had been used by Eileen Cody in the past, and a lot of people had come to hear her talk, and so I thought, well, we'll try to go and fish where the fish are. And so here I am. There's so much to talk about. I really am more interested in answering questions than I am in making a speech. I don't really think you need to be treated to a political speech, because no matter what I do, I will only talk about 3 or 4 things, and then there's 27 other things you want to ask. So I would merely say that this is a session of Congress unlike anything I have ever seen. I was in the state legislature a long time, and then I went to Congress, and I've been there 23 years. This session is populated by a large mass of people who were elected last year with no philosophy except to go and dismantle the government. So what you're seeing is a determined effort to actually undo everything that is what we think of as the government. Whether you're talking about environment or labor or education or whatever, they're about taking it apart and getting rid of it, believing that no government is the answer to our problems in this country. And it's a nihilistic approach that really makes no sense at all. The American people do want clean air, and the American people do want clean water, and they do want health care, and they do want education, and they do want a lot of things. So this session we're just barely into it, and you will see in the next couple of weeks we're coming to a crunch. We don't have a budget for this year, and so you are looking at running on what's called a continuing resolution. That means the same thing that we did last week we're going to do next week. And so far they've been doing it 2 weeks at a time, which anybody who runs a business knows is absolutely nonsense. You don't run anything 2 weeks at a time. You can't make contracts, you can't figure out anything if you don't know if you're going to have your money. And that is going along for this year. And then the other thing that has to be dealt with is that we have a debt limit. And that means how much the United States can borrow from the world. We have an actual number in the budget that says how much we can borrow. And we're up just about against it. We're going to have to raise the debt limit again. And there are some people who say they will not raise the debt limit no matter what. And that's good talk. But it just doesn't make sense in the economic system in which we presently live. If we don't raise the debt limit, bonds won't pay their interest, and there's a whole bunch of things that will begin to collapse in terms of pension funds and all sorts of things that go on if the Congress would not raise the debt limit, and therefore would allow the economics to begin to collapse. So the next 3 weeks are going to be sort of interesting in this regard. We'll see. They say that they're going to take out Obamacare, and they're going to take out family planning and National Public Radio and the EPA and everything else as a part of agreeing to extend the continuing resolution and deal with the debt limit. So we'll see. I see a hand. Let's start with a question.
Yeah, first I have something for you, but I wanted to ask you, when is the Congress, and you specifically, going to vote to defund all the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Pakistan, wherever else we're fighting? Because that's the part of the government that's going ahead with borrowed money, and we don't have any money here at home for anything. We could create green sustain jobs and adapt to climate change here if we didn't spend all this money on war and occupation. In addition, we give money to the Israeli military so they can continue their occupation of Palestinian territories. So when is this all going to stop? And the lives, not to even think about the lives, which are the most important thing that's being lost, but all the billions that we could bring home. And I hope that you will commit to wearing that button on the House floor. Thank you.
Okay. Next,
Is there an answer to that question?
Could you answer the question about the Israeli occupation, please?
I'm sorry?
Could you answer her question about the Israeli occupation?
About
West Seattle
defunding
Herald.
wars, too.
The Israeli occupation. What was
Do
your
you want to
question?
repeat what you said?
The main kernel of her question related to the billions that are being spent on the major wars.
Yeah, defunding
There-
the wars.
Including Libya and Israel.
Clearly, there are plenty of us who have opposed the war effort. I stood and called the president a liar
Well, I know that.
on Iraq. So I've got bona fides that I have stood out there and said, this is wrong. So don't lump us all together.
I'm not lumping
Okay?
it together,
Well,
but it's money.
you're acting as though none of us have tried to slow down this business. The question is really what's going on with the American people that they don't understand. They send members to Congress who vote for this over and over again and do not want to pay for it.
Well, that's corporate funding of elections.
Well, okay, but so then we're really coming back to a much more fundamental question. If you're going to change the Congress, you're going to change it by changing the way campaigns are financed. And if you don't change the way campaigns are financed, then you will continue to get this. I heard there's an interesting guy in town on yesterday named Jeffrey Toobin who wrote a book about the Supreme Court. And he talked about where the major shift has happened in this political process, and he said it was 2008. The day the Supreme Court elected George Bush, after that they began making decisions that have been changing this country dramatically, one of which is the citizens' decision about the financing from corporations. The corporations can put all the money they want into a campaign. And this last election was the first time you saw that, and you're going to see it again in 2012. And you are going to have to deal with the fact that if there's no ground game, if there's no grassroots effort, then you will get another Congress the same.
Well, yeah, except that I think that there is a grassroots effort, and I think it's growing, and I think that there's another way, in addition to campaign finance reform, because I think elections are only a small part of this.
Okay, what is
I
it?
think the days of rage are coming, and I think they're coming here in the United States sooner rather than later.
Well, what are you saying? I should encourage that, or what?
Well, I'm not saying that you should be aware. I think you should be aware of it, okay? And I think
I am perfectly aware of it. All right, we're at about 1959 is where we are. Yes, sir.
In yesterday's New York Times, there was an article about how GE paid zero tax last year.
I think they paid an effective rate of 3%, but maybe it was zero. Okay.
I think the article came out as I think it came out as they actually paid zero tax last year, which is someone who doesn't make a lot of money. I still pay some tax. It was a little absurd. And it talked about how in 2008, GE heavily lobbied the Ways and Means Committee. And specifically called out Charlie Rangel as someone they lobbied very heavily. I believe you were in the Ways and Means Committee at that time. I'm curious what your recollection of the passage of those tax loopholes, that process, and your role.
I voted no every single time. That's my role. They never talk to me. The lobbyists don't talk to me because they know where I'm coming from. So I'm not in on a lot of the discussions that one might suggest have happened in Washington, D.C. Frankly, it hasn't made a whole lot of difference having Obama as president in terms of taxes. His his willingness to fold in terms of standing up to the tax business is, in my view, not been productive for the country and has actually sunk us deeper in the hole. If you're doing the kinds of things that you're seeing in the state legislature here, and you're seeing the things that we're doing at the federal level, because we say we have no money, but you won't take it from people who make more than $250,000, you're really talking out of both sides of your mouth. And you ought to clarify what you really believe, because you don't mean it that you care about people if you won't tax people over $250,000. I don't ever worry. I don't spend a single minute worrying about people who make $250,000. Because I figure that one way or another they can tighten their belt maybe one notch and probably make it. But there are a lot of people in this society who are being hurt just badly. And we're really crushing the middle class. That's what the process is going on. Somebody gave me something out of Mother Jones when I walked in here. The middle class is being crushed. I mean, I was the chairman of the subcommittee in the House over the last 6 years, that spent more money than any other single member of Congress. I dealt out the unemployment benefits. I spent $100 billion in unemployment benefits in this country. And yesterday, the governor of Michigan says, I'm going to cut unemployment benefits. So you just start thinking about what that means when state governments are starting to say we're going to cut unemployment benefits. And for us not to be talking about tax reform for General Electric is, in my view, just absolute nonsense. Nobody is paying. They talk about a 35% rate, but then you look at what the effective tax rate that these companies are paying, and I thought General Electric, on the sheet that I saw, said 3%, but maybe it was 0 last year. For all I know, that may well be correct. And after they start cleaning up the mess in Japan and start dealing with the lawsuits that come out of because there's a lot of GE equipment in what's happening on the coast of Japan. So they're going to be in lawsuit heaven while they settle out those claims from the Japanese government about the adequacy of their nuclear power plant. So to talk about tax reform with those guys, and for the president to pick that guy and say, this is my #1 tax guy. This is my #1 contact in the business community. Here's where the loopholes are. Says something very powerful that I don't like to see, but that's what we're dealing with. Yes, I see a hand in the back.
Short question, what do we do about corporate control of elections in Congress with the Supreme Court decision, whatever it was, United?
The only
power to buy elections, what do we do?
Could you repeat the question?
His question was, what do we do about corporate control of elections from the money side that's been pouring in because of the Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago? A democracy will. Winston Churchill said, is the worst form of government until you consider the alternatives. And the fact is that the people are going to have to get angry and take it back. And somebody said there's rage out there. Well, yeah, there is rage. It's called the Tea Party. The Tea Party is it's a group of people who are responding to anger and rage and uncertainty and anxiety. They don't know where they're going. They have no plan whatsoever, no coherent. It's not the Progressive Party of 1910. I mean, if you look at the Progressive Party platform in 1910, they had unemployment insurance, Social Security, national health insurance. They had all this stuff. I mean, they had an agenda. The Tea Party does not have an agenda, and they are being manipulated by the money at the top that funds them to stir up the process. Now, there has to be an alternative to that develop in this country. Probably a third party is going to have to come. Whether it's the Progressive Party or whatever it's called, I don't know. But there's going to be a third party come where people are going to have to begin organizing at the grassroots level. Everything the progressive parties started in 1910 ultimately was taken by the Democrats and put in place. And that has to start at the bottom when the people suddenly begin to say, I ain't going to take this anymore. Now, the Tea Party is saying, I ain't going to take this anymore, but they don't know where they're going. So there has not yet emerged in this country a movement to make the kinds of changes that need to be made. And if you put members of Congress out and say you've got to raise $2 million to get elected, I mean, if I took $100 from each one of you, I wouldn't have enough to do that. And you realize that if you don't have public funding, or you don't have some way like the Brits do or something, if you don't have a different election system, you are simply going to have the continuation of this, and the middle class is going to get crushed and crushed and crushed. Because one of the things that Obama went for, which some of us were against, was reducing your contribution on Social Security. 0.6% is what you contribute out of your paycheck on Social Security. The president said, well, we can drop it down to 4% and give the money. That'll be more money in the people's pockets and they'll be happy. What that amounted to was taking money out of the Social Security fund and making it look even worse. Now, if you try and bring it back, when it was 6/10, you drop it down to 4. That's a third that you're cutting it. You can all understand the math of that, right? Now you've got it at 0.4, and you're going to put 2 on top again. That's a 50% increase. So the president led us to believe that he was willing to go on the stump, arguing to raise the Social Security tax back up 50%. Anybody here believe him? There's one. Anybody else believe him? See, that my view is that they never should have gone for that deal. And so the middle class should get crushed everywhere we go. And it's only when they get angry, and I've kidded with my staff, I think we're in 1959. Because some of you remember the 60s. It was a little tumultuous in this country. And that's because the people stood up and said, we're through with this. We're not going to have this anymore. I was in high school in the 50s, and, everybody was paying attention to their books, and everything's going just fine. And all of a sudden, 1960s came, and boom. And that's what's going to happen in this country in the near future, unless there's an absolute reversal of what's going on right now, and I don't see it happening, frankly. I mean, that may be pessimistic, but in my view, it is an accurate reflection of what is going on. And I think that people, the lady wants me to stop the war. I'd like to stop the war. I mean, but the fact is that it's going to take the people to get aggravated. Yeah, right there. You don't have to stand up.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the, 4 years ago I came to you about the VA, and at that time we didn't have any type of aquatic therapy for all the people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, finally, they broke ground last week for the 2 aquatic therapy groups. So, thank you very much for that. We got $12 million for a brand new polytrauma center. Now, the problem that we have up there is this. That place is not broken. It's shattered. We don't have a wound care clinic. The amputation rate is the highest in the VA system. Last year I spent 4.5 months in that hospital. I went in for a small ingrown toenail, and I came out with 4 toes missing. In addition to that, I had to almost go to jail to keep them from taking my foot off. The problem that we have is that the management is insensitive to the veterans' health care. That's the first one. The second thing is, we have a staff that is completely overworked. These people, last week we had a nurse that fall dead as she reported to work. They couldn't find her for 2 hours, and they found her in the changing room where she had a heart attack. 2 weeks before that, we had a veteran that threatened to kill one of the patients at because you can't get anything done. Now, I represent a group called Veterans and Friends of Puget Sound. And as you know, we came to you about 4 years ago, and of all the people we wrote, you were the only one that came to our rescue. We need to have somebody, be it a congressional investigation or a congressional town hall meeting at that place to get it straightened out. Now, I also found out that you or any other elected official cannot walk into that hospital unless you let them know that you're coming ahead of time. Now, I don't think this is right. I feel that, first of all, number one, and I keep telling the director this, that's our hospital. It doesn't say employees' hospital on the outside of that building. Now, we have tried and tried and tried to mitigate some of these problems with him, and the final straw was when we had a meeting with him about 3 or 4 months ago, he sent me a letter telling me not to bother him anymore. I have it in my briefcase. Do not come to me. You go to the patient's advocate. Well, I am sick and tired of going up there, waiting for 4 or 5 hours, like my time doesn't count, or any other veteran's time doesn't count. And at the end of the day, they say to us, you have to reschedule. This is absolutely atrocious. We defended our country. We deserve better than this. And I am so upset about this until I'm trying to do this thing the right way by coming to my elected officials and letting them know. However, if we don't get anything done, we're going to take to the streets. Because this is not the way we should be treated.
I don't disagree with you. My view is that my opposition to the Iraq War was I saw what happened in Vietnam. And if you've seen a movie before, you don't have to see it twice. And what is happening now is even worse because we have less people who have participated in the pain of this war, families and others. We've got certainly lots of veterans who've been shot up in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the public is totally aware. If you went out in the street and asked people, well, what's happening in Afghanistan? What's happening in Iraq? A story on television is 1.9 minutes long if it's a long story. And if I get a quote, it's 19 seconds. So that's the way people are getting their information. And Afghanistan has dropped off the radar, and Iraq certainly has dropped off the radar. In Afghanistan, we're still talking about, well, we're doing better, although people are getting killed everywhere. And my view is that nobody wants to look at what I call the tail of war, which is what happens after the war is over, after all the parades are over and after everybody comes home. Then we deal with the problems of veterans. And you can find veterans on the streets of Seattle today from the Iraq War who are homeless. So, well, certainly from the Vietnam War, but you can find them already from the Iraq War. It's not like this is some phenomenon that isn't happening. And I'm one of about 7 members of Congress. If you come to my office, you'll see the faces of everybody who's died from Washington. And a group came in from Blanchette High School, and the teacher said to me, she waited until everybody was gone, and she said, thank you for putting those pictures up. The boy I went to the prom with is on that wall. And most people have totally, Congress does not want to have that up. They didn't want us, we used to have them on placards, on easels sitting out in front of my office. And they said it's in the way of the people moving in the hallway, so you gotta get rid of those. So I stuck them up on the wall. I said, they'll have to scrape them off. But the fact is that we're not facing what the Veterans Administration is gonna face. And I agree with you. I'll do what I can. Yes, sir, back there.
On the topic of healthcare.
Yes.
We're kind of a nation of consumers, and we drive across the street to save a penny on gas. But when it comes to healthcare, I think we're horrible consumers, where we don't know what anything costs until we get the bill in the mail. Would you be open to a suggestion of maybe kind of like what was done decades ago with auto repair, where you get an estimate before any repairs are done? Knowing what something costs before anything is done. I just got to go the other day for some dental work, and I knew it would be about 50%, but it's listed with all these codes that nobody knows what they mean. But I think if hospitals, clinics out there, you could get them to advertise their price, or at least know what it is before it's done. If I go to have LASIK eye surgery, I know exactly what it's going to cost. And though that competition keeps costs down, and if I know it's going to cost $1,000 here to get scanned, because I work in healthcare, and I see scans being done all the time, go somewhere else as a consumer to get it done cheaper.
The issue of whether or not health care can be dealt with on an individual basis is a real interesting concept, because when you buy your insurance policy, you don't know what's going to happen to you, so you don't know what to buy. You don't know, if you knew you were going to get cancer, you'd buy one thing, and if you thought you were going to have a root canal, you'd buy another thing. And so you never know when you're buying. And then the time comes when you need something. And at that point, my son and I talked about this. They were driving down to the hospital when his wife needed a C-section. You don't, at that point, do much shopping. You just go to the emergency room and get the C-section done so the kid doesn't die. So, and then you have all the elective stuff, and it is very hard to get hospitals to release their information because it's going to take a law to get them to release their information so that you could actually go through and see what a gallbladder costs in this hospital, what in this hospital. And I am supportive of giving patients as much access to information as I can. But I think ultimately the decisions about how much we spend is going to be decided by the government. Now I'll tell you what I'm doing on that regard, because healthcare costs are just going out of sight. Nothing else is going up 18, 20, 30, 40% a year. So why is your premium on your insurance company going up that way? Well, when we wrote Medicare, at the last moment, the doctors got a provision in there that said, we will pay your usual and customary fees, which means doctors set the prices. Now, when you go to a doctor's office, he basically, or she basically, says, take your clothes off, tell me what's the matter with you, and then they tell you, go down and get a test here, and go get treatment over here, and take this pharmaceutical, and they control everything in the system, how much is spent. My friend of mine went into Swedish. This is a 69-year-old woman, got some back pain, she's a little bit overweight, came out with two CAT scans and one MRI, and a bill for $10,000 and a bottle of pills. All sent to Medicare, right? Now, you ask yourself, was that the simplest way to deal with this woman's back pain? Was that necessary to do 2 CAT scans and 1 MRI? So there ultimately has to be controls from the government side. There is a committee of the AMA called the RUC Committee. Most people have never heard of it. It is the most invisible committee in the whole of the medical industrial complex. But this is a committee that makes recommendations to Medicare about what procedures should have an increase. And 95% of what the doctors recommend from the RUC committee to the Medicare is adopted. So the doctors are setting the prices in Medicare, and they are going to set the prices in the whole of the system. And there has to be payment reform in healthcare in this country. Fee-for-service medicine has got to be adjusted some way so that there is some kind of control on it. You just can't be, the public can't continue to pay whatever the doctor asks. Now, there's also a tremendous disparity between primary care docs who are doing family medicine and doctors who are doing specialists. The specialists are doing reasonably well, as opposed to the primary care doctors who can hardly make it pay and make a buck for their own family. So there is there's a real divide in medicine between doctors who think and do talking and talk to people and people who do things. And people who do things get paid well, and people who talk to patients don't do so well. Yes?
Is there also, I tried to download the healthcare reform bill, but my computer pretty much seized up and the file's so big. But there's also the work reform. I do CT scans as a technologist, and I do a lot of scans for people. And you just look at it, and radiologists, when they look at it on why, you just see a lot of liability driven. If you don't do it, and I think doctors are overwhelmed because you see 100 patients a day, you have about 10 minutes with that doctor, and sometimes you bring up one topic that wasn't scheduled, and they're like, no, come back. But I do a lot of scan, a lot of imaging.
Healthcare is no longer a service industry. It is a business. And the amortization of CAT scans and MRIs requires them to be used a lot. And so a lot of it is blamed on defensive medicine, but in fact is not necessary. And people can practice good medicine and get good health care without having an MRI every time they go into the doctor's office. And I'm not saying that happens every time, but boy, it happens a lot. And the fact is that the tort reform issue can also be dealt with if doctors and lawyers would sit down and work out a way. There's a way to avoid about 90% of what tort reform is really all about medical lawsuits for liability. Because the things that people are worried about is future health care and money that they lose from being off their job because they've lost their ability to go to work. And then there's pain and suffering. The first two are very easy to figure out. You know how long you're off work, you give them some money for that. If they are going to have future health care, you take care of it, no matter what it costs. Then the pain and suffering question is a little more difficult, but it's not the insoluble problem that it's not the reason costs are going up. It's only about 2% of the cost. So all of it can be changed, but it's going to take the Congress taking on a new payment reform or payment mechanism for healthcare, generally speaking, and it's very tough. Yes, sir.
I'm a Vietnam vet, and Obama put this.
Walk up into the doorway so they can hear in this room.
Obama put something in place to help people with their mortgages and housing and stuff. This money and this program that he put together. It seems as though that nothing happens with this program, and I've been to about 10 different places, and all of them said no. So I'm saying, what was the stipulation of putting it in place for, especially for people and veterans, and you go to get your house refinanced, and they tell you no? I mean, what is that? I mean, I thought it was in place to help us, but it seems to be a deterrent that said you don't qualify, or your payment, your house is too high for us to refinance you, or whatever. What goes with that?
Let me go back a step. When the collapse occurred in 2007, some of us thought that the banks should be taken over by the government. That the government should run the banks and make the banks do what banks are supposed to do. Not gamble with people's money and derivatives and all that kind of stuff. But deal with loans to small business and deal with homeowners and so forth. The administration, unfortunately, was led by Geithner and Larry Summers, some of the guys who actually created the problem, and they were not about to take over the bank system. So what we did alternatively was to say, here's money to the banks. Do what's the right thing. Now, you know how well that works. I mean, you can see how well that works in lots of things, and it simply didn't work. We gave them money, and we said, now start figuring out, you've got 7 million people in this country whose mortgages are in foreclosure. Do something for these people. Do the right thing. Well, they didn't do anything. That was the first thing Franklin Delano Roosevelt did, in fact, in 1933. When he took over, that's the first issue he dealt with was home foreclosures. And it should have been the first thing we dealt with in this one, but we let the banks have control of it. So then we put in a bill called HAMP, which is Housing Assistance, I don't know all the acronyms, but Housing Assistance anyway. Setting up a mechanism by which banks would be able to make adjustments. They've helped about 500,000 homeowners. You got 7 million people in trouble, and they've helped 500,000. So you get a feeling for how fast they're moving. And now this bunch that's in the Congress are saying, let's take out the HAMP program altogether. It's a waste. Let the market work it out. And so we simply are not taking care of not only the veterans, but the middle class generally in this country. We're way past the people who are speculating and the people who are buying a house that's too big. And, you know, people hold up these examples of some illegal immigrant who suddenly got a $400,000 house and say that's the reason there's that. All those people are they're in the ditch. But now what you're dealing with are people all over this country who are caught in owning a house, and maybe they, in 2007, which was the high point of the crazy sales to everybody was buying 3-year arms. So they bought an arm, and now it's 2010, 3 years later, right? And they can't get a bank to refinance them because the bank says, well, that house you bought for $400 is now only worth $325. So bring in $75,000 and we'd be glad to refinance your house. Right. So the answer to that is write the damn principle down to where it is today. That's what we tried to get into law. We didn't succeed very well, and to the extent we did get adjustments, these people, the 500,000 that made it, had small reductions. But the banks don't want to take the losses because the stockholders will lose money. Oh, isn't that awful?
But then they tell you to come back when you lose your home.
Right. So this is it is a veterans issue, but it is also a general societal issue. There's all kinds of people in all kinds of situations who are losing their houses today, who are paying on the loan, but they won't refinance them because they use the arm as the excuse for raising the interest rate, which raises the payment and makes you come in, and they get the house. Now, there's going to be another bunch of this, because in 2007, if you add 5 to that, that's 2012. So the people who took 5-year arms are going to be in trouble right in the middle of the election, 2012. So this 2010, the mess we got now, is going to be, I mean, we're going to see this movie all over again in worse shape. And I've done what I can, but in fact, we have failed to deal with this situation. And there's every reason for people. That's why, as I say, the Tea Party's angry. They see this happening, because some of them are in it. They're suddenly realizing, they thought, well, let's downsize and we'll buy into this place. And suddenly they find themselves in a pickle. They're going to lose their house. Yes, sir.
This sort of goes to a phrase you said towards the end about, that you tried and that you made a little improvement in what was happening. In your time in Congress, what have you done what accomplishment have you made that you're most proud of? That's a pretty open-ended question.
Wow.
You've been there for a while, so.
Can I sit down and think about that?
If you want, you can answer the question and come back.
There are several things that I'm proud of. One is the health care bill getting started. I mean, I've been talking about health care for this country since 1972. I made my first speech for Canadian health care. Health care went in Canada. Tommy Douglas got it in Saskatchewan in the 60s. And I knew about it and said, why can't we do it in the state of Washington? That's what the basic health plan was really all about. It was my attempt to try and start it in the state of Washington. So when I got to Congress, I said, we're going to, and finally we got something started. Now, God knows it ain't what I would have done. But it is a start, and I'm determined that we're going to make it work, and we're going to figure out how to make it work for everybody. That's one thing I feel pleased with. There are some other things. My work in AIDS internationally has been, we've gotten the PEPFAR money and all of that stuff that's gone out to treat patients worldwide is something that I spend a lot of time on. There's also things locally, like getting the seawall, getting money for the seawall to prevent us from sliding into the sea. So there's big things and little things, and I never got all I wanted on anything.
No one ever does.
And so I don't know what the biggest, I guess the healthcare thing is probably as completed as I feel.
What element of the current healthcare, it was just, it was passed a year ago, almost to the day. What element of it do you think is different because you were pushing for that element? How is it different because you were in Congress?
When 435 people make a bowl of soup, it's hard to tell. I mean, there's a provision in there that states can do things like the basic health plan. And so we've tucked away into it some things that will work for the state of Washington. I think ultimately that health care in this country is going to be that there's a federal payment system, but every state designs their own delivery system. Because I think we're all different. We're different than Alabama, or we're different than Vermont. And to try and say, here's the one plan that everybody's going to use is simply not going to work. And I wanted to keep the possibility for states to do their own thing. That's the biggest part for me, was somehow finding a way to give states flexibility, because I think ultimately that's what's going to happen. State legislature is going to go back and have to design how they're going to deliver a set of benefits that are given across the country. Every state ought to have the same benefits. How you deliver those benefits should be designed by the local people, the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, and all the people who are involved in it. So we'll get there eventually. Yes?
Hi, my name is Mariam Pouton, and I'm actually a project director for an HIV and substance abuse program at Neighborhood House, and we work with foreign-born population that come from countries with high HIV rates, such as Ethiopia, Cambodia, and of course Vietnam is the only country that's received some kind of PEPFAR or CFAR funding in Asia. So my question is, what is the concentrated work locally, because this area has very high foreign-born population from countries like that, and there's limited funding to do prevention work. Basic HIV testings and HIV education is very limited, certainly in foreign-born population, but for APIs, Cambodians and Vietnamese, there's nothing out there.
Her question is, what money is available, or our program is going to be available to deal with the problems of legal immigrants to the United States who are here and have diseases like AIDS and other things. I think that one of the things that I don't like to segregate people into populations. I know your job is that. You're dealing with those people. But public health is something that affects all of us. And the number one cause of death in this country in 1900 was tuberculosis. That was the number one cause of death. And over the years, we learned how to treat it, and the number of deaths went down. And we thought it was gone. When I was in medical school, if you saw a case of tuberculosis, that was a big deal. Everybody ran over to Cook County to see this case. Now it's coming back because our prevention programs are not being in the public health departments are being cut away. They're being cut away in King County, and they're being cut away all over the country. And so dealing with these illnesses is, while there's certainly in the immigrant populations, but it's also among us. And the reason I was very sensitive about this was because there was actually an epidemic of tuberculosis in the House dining room. The House, the Congress in Washington, D.C., they had somebody was working around doing the tables, and that's all it takes, because I've now spit my tuberculosis out on, when you ride one of those crowded buses in this city, you're standing, you don't know who you're standing next to or what they have. And if you don't have a public health system that's looking at this and figuring it out and treating and making it possible for it not to be spread, you are simply going to have it come back. And people, Iman's initiative that took away that tab tax that we used to have on your license plates on your cars, one of the things it killed was public health in this state, because that money was used for the public health system. And you take that away, you can get by for a while, but ultimately you want restaurants to have somebody come in and check the cleanliness of the kitchen. I mean, don't you? I mean, unless you're crazy. And so this issue is the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger public health issue, which is really a question about what's in the common good. Because what is missing in this society now is a sense of the common good. What's good for me should be good for all of you, and what's good for that lady is good for everybody in here, and what's good for that man there is good for the whole place. The minute we start saying the McDermotts will take care of themselves, and we don't care what happens to the rest of you, the thing starts coming apart. Because if you don't take care of these people, ultimately, it's like that old commercial that some of you may remember from television, from the Fram air filter commercial, pay me now or pay me later. And that's really what is at issue in what's going on right now in the Congress, with wiping out this sense of community that we all are responsible for each other. And the minute there's somebody I don't care about, and I guess I already said I didn't care much about people above 250. But actually I care about them because they go into the restaurant and sit at the next table. So they're being exposed to the same sort of thing that all of us. Everybody has a stake in it, and there isn't anybody who shouldn't pay taxes to their ability. I don't believe people should be taxed into the poorhouse. But on the other hand, I do believe that people ought to be taxed, and the attitude of I won't pay taxes unless I get a direct benefit for me is simply so selfish and so short-sighted that it will not succeed. The country will come apart. We will have chaos in the streets, as somebody's already suggested. People are going to go and say, and they did it in the 60s, we saw it, and we are going to see it again if we're not careful. Sir.
Earlier we were talking about in order to deal with campaign finance reform and things of that nature, we need to have like a strong grassroots movement to move it forward. What things are necessary to successfully organize and fuel a grassroots movement so that it achieves its end goal?
Well, I always think of Margaret Mead when I hear that kind of a question. She said, never doubt that a small group of people, in fact, only a small group of people, have made changes in the world. A group of people who decide we're going to change this thing and start working. And that's what's going to develop in this country, is a grassroots movement around election reform in this country is going to start. There have been those in the past. And they will come again, because people will decide, if we don't do this, all hope is lost. And at that point, when you got nothing left to lose, why, you are a determined group of people who start putting things together. And you can see, I mean, all the things that have happened in this state with initiatives, or you've seen it with all kinds of things in neighborhoods, things that have been changed in neighborhoods. Everybody agrees we are not going to let that come in here, right? I had two people in my office this week came into me and they wanted to talk about, we want to deal with global warming. And the Chinese are buying all the coal in Montana and they're shipping it to China. How can we stop them shipping it out of the United States? And the two places they want to stop are Longview, Washington, and Bellingham, where they have two ports. And they want to stop any coal going out to China. Well, there's a group of people who are trying to stop that. And I think that's the way the political process is going to happen. And groups are going to make a common cause with one another. Because there's one group over here, and we want this, and there's another group wants that, and another group over here, and they're all operating, and they don't talk to one another. Ultimately, it's got to come together.
Democratic Party.
I'm sorry?
To the Democratic Party.
Well, unfortunately, the Democratic Party's lost that. But that's how we did campaign finance reform. When I was the chairman of the Coalition for Open Government in 1972, when we wrote the initiative that created the campaign finance agency in the state government. I mean, that was done by the people. It didn't come from inside. It came from the outside with a group of people called the Coalition for Open Government that required lobbyists to report and required candidates to report and required limits on campaign spending. I mean, we did all that in 1970, but it's been eroded over the course of time, and it's got to be done again. I mean, reform has to go on in a society because the interests that want things never give up. They keep coming back trying to get it back. Yes, sir. Or ma'am, I guess. Sorry.
Just addressing the grassroots issue. I'm a member of a Latino theater collective, and part of our mission is to work very directly with community groups in mixing art and community activism. And the next project we're going to be working on is with South Park Community Center. And we're doing a production of a play called Electricidad, which is a Chicano barrio version of the Electra, the Greek tragedy, and it's really exciting because it specifically addresses gang violence, which is a huge problem in the country and in this city. It turns out that we're like #1 for drive-by shootings. And this, of course, gets into immigration and targeting and scapegoating. So what we're doing is we're working with leaders in South Park Community Center to revitalize that and to do the production there, to bring in kids, to have panels. And, so that's like really starting at the bottom and getting and educating and working together with communities. So.
Well, that's one of the things.
I wrote a letter to you, but my printer didn't work, but this is good. I'll send you a letter.
I'll look at it. One of the things that's happened in this country around the issue of immigration reform is that it has been used by those who don't want you to get together and start working together at the grassroots. They want you to fight with, and so you're a little bit browner than I am, so she ain't in my group, right? And I'm with her, but no, you're obviously something else. And so, and when we start looking and recognizing that we're not all in this together, and if they get him, they're going to get me too. Because that was the message of Dietrich Bonhoeffer coming out of. He died in the concentration camps, and he said when they came for the trade unionists, I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. And when they came for the socialists, I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't stand up. And when they came for the Catholics, I wasn't. And when they came for me, nobody stood up. And that's really the issue that we are struggling with right now, is the people at the top trying to divide us into this group and that group and make us afraid of any. What's going on to Muslims in this country is awful. But this is not new. It happened to the Japanese, and it happened to the Spanish, and it's happened to every group. When we find somebody to hate, then we can hate them, and that's our problem group. And we really have to get back together and solve some of these very deep issues, because NPR Radio reported that in 2040, we're going to be a brown country. And there's certainly a lot of people who don't like that idea. Okay? But the fact is that we're all immigrants. Everybody came from somewhere, and the reason we're a strong country is because the best and the brightest and the toughest and most adventuresome came. I did my family history, and I went back to Ireland, where my family came from. And I went and talked to, there's a clan chieftain called the McDermott. There's 4 of them in Ireland. And this guy, I said to him, do you have any history about us? And he said, well, I'll tell you this. The good ones and the strong ones got away. So this country is filled with aggressive, smart, creative people. That's why we're the country we are. And the whole issue of dealing with electoral reform and making sure that everybody gets a fair shot here. And that's really what it's all about. It's about social and justice, equity. If we don't allow everybody to have equity and social justice in this society, then we're all at risk. Because the minute I'm willing to sacrifice him, it'll be me next. And I think that we struggle with that. And we've been struggling. Abraham Lincoln put the Republican Party together with the Nativist Party, they were called the Know Nothings. They said, what's your platform? They said, I don't know nothing. What they meant was, I'm Protestant and I speak English. And he put on top of them the Whigs. That's where the Republican Party came from. So every time we get this nativist stuff popping up, it's been going on for 150 years in this country.
So
Yes.
we have time for one more question.
All right.
So the grassroots on Labor got a good little jump start on the grassroots back in Wisconsin here recently.
They did.
But what we're looking for is to keep that conversation at the top also going, so that as we bring those two together, because we're reaching out to the community, environmental groups, everything else, and we have a common cause. And the numbers are in that our middle class is really quite fast. And we can't work another job. We definitely can't have another spouse to help support that house.
Well, you could, but it's complicated.
But as we're rallying, bringing out thousands of people across the United States, pushing this message forward, it seems that some of these foreign problems that we have are overshadowing what the conversation here in the United States. And that's just something I'm looking for back in D.C. is to keep that alive, whether it's the congressional hearings or any other avenues.
Well, I'll tell you something. I'm hopeful. I mean, I might sound negative or sound down, but I am not. Wisconsin was very energizing because these people, public employees, they pay taxes, they participate, they live in this society, they're not do-nothings. And the fact that they have a job and a pension and a health care plan, like somebody working for some company, they're not any different. And they stood up and said, no, we're not backing up. And ultimately, that message is that we can't keep backing up to the corporations and giving back and giving back and giving back, because pretty soon we ain't going to have nothing. And my view is that the Congress is seeing that and realizing that this whole business about the deficit is being used as a subterfuge to say, let's break unions, particularly public employee unions. Because what happened, actually the judge that put the stay on that whole business in Wisconsin said, when you split the two issues, the budget issues from the union busting issues, and pass the union busting issues because you needed 2/3 to pass the budget issue, you split that off and you said, well, let's just bust the union. You came out of the closet, so to speak. Because you then were saying what you really were about, which was busting the unions. It was not about balancing the budget in Wisconsin. And I think that you're going to see, I hope, I'm counting on people picking up on the steam of that, the momentum of that, and carrying it into this election. Because if people back up and say, well, we can't do anything, we're done. We can do something. We can change it. We will keep, I mean, the wars, all of this stuff, my view is that ultimately we should, and I didn't wear my right coat. I have a coat, button on my coat that says, bring the troops home. I think we ought to be out of Afghanistan. Yes. And I think that because we never knew why we were there, and since you don't know why you're there, well, then you can turn and go off to Iraq. Well, we knew why we were there, but we haven't figured out that one yet. That's not over yet. For anybody to think there's a democracy functioning in Iraq, and then we're going to walk away in July 1, and there'll be a functioning democracy, simply doesn't understand what's going on over there. So my view is that the people have got to push back on the government and find ways to do that. And the Tea Party thing gave us the template, but we need to have a more organized agenda for what we want.
Better messaging.
More informed from the.
Thank you all for coming.